Hi guys, and welcome back to Dizzy Sew and Sew. I'm Dave Dawson, and today's tutorial is going to be a simple centered zip insertion. We're doing this skills tutorial here because the next project is going to be our first garment. It's going to be a skirt, and you need to know how to do this along with the other skills to make that skirt. I'm really looking forward to making our first garment, but for now let's get on with the zip. What you need is your sewing machine and all your bits to go with that, some pins, etc. You need one zip, just not an invisible zip or anything like that, it's just a standard zip. Okay, and then two bits of fabric to practice with. Okay, so let's give it a go, let's see how we get on. Okay, so the first thing we do is we take our fabric and we lay it on top of each other, lining up the edge. Right sides to right sides. Okay. Then we lay our zip on. That's not very straight, is it? Then we lay our zip on, remembering that if you're going to turn a hem at the top, to make sure you leave enough space for that, we'll just use the length of the zip tape. And then with some tailor's chalk, or a pencil if you haven't got any, just mark a line where the zip stop is across. And that's because we're going to sew all the way along this edge with our seam allowance. But when we get to this point, this being the bottom, this being the top, when we get to this point here where we've marked, we're going to change to a basting stitch to hold the garment in place while we put our zip in, and then we'll unpick that once the zip's put in to allow it to open. But you'll see what I mean as we go on. So before we sew the seam for our zip insertion, what we would do normally is some sort of neatening on the seam allowances. We might zigzag them. If we've got an overlocker, we could use our overlocker, but we're not going to do that today. We're just going to concentrate on the zip insertion. But just give it a go yourself. You can even use the bias binding techniques we looked at in the earlier videos, which will use some more high-end garments to finish off those seam allowances before you put the zip in. So I mentioned a basting stitch, and you're probably thinking, what's a basting stitch? Well, it's basically the same straight stitch but much longer. So if we look at our sewing machine, and I'll show you, if we look at our sewing machine, we can change the stitch length to as high as it can go. A lot of sewing machines now, modern sewing machines, have a very long basting stitch. But you set it as long as the longest stitch length you have, and that will be your basting stitch. So we can unpick it nice and easily at the end. So let's start to sew our hem. We've got a 5/8 seam allowance. So I've lined it up with the 5/8 on my sewing machine. We're going to start on a stitch length of 2, which is our normal straight seam stitch length. And start as we normally would with a bit of back with a lock stitch. Now we come up to the mark we made when we measured our zip, and I'm going to back stitch to lock it in place there. Zips take a lot of stress, so do quite a robust lock stitch there, and then we're going to change to the basting stitch. That's the longest stitch your sewing machine will do, and then carry on with the seam. So we've sewn our seam in place and we've pressed it open. We've got a normal size 2 stitch, and then into the basting stitch, which is size 4 on my machine. It's as large as it can go. And now we need to take our zip and place it face down along that seam line. So with the zip running, the teeth of the zip running straight down the centre of the seam, pin one side to the seam allowance. So you're taping the seam, the zip tape, pinning the zip tape to the seam allowance. All the way down. All the way down on one side. So we haven't gone through the front of the fabric, just that seam allowance. I'll just turn that so you can see better. And then we're going to sew down this edge to fix the zip in place, and then we'll do the other side. Before we can sew our zip on, we're going to have to change to a zip foot, and this is it's very simple on my machine. On other machines it might need you to use a little screwdriver to unscrew the screw here, but I've got a little lever. Just pop it down, pull that off, and then you put the new foot underneath and push the lever up. It'll be exactly the same with the screw, except you undo the screw, push it in, and then you do the screw up. If you have any queries on that, your best port of call is your sewing machine instruction manual, and they're brilliant. Never throw them away. They're full of fantastic information. So as I want to sew the right hand piece of zip tape, I'm going to slide my foot over in this direction, so that when the side of the foot sits up against the teeth, I've got about 4 millimeters distance between the zip teeth and the stitching, and this is important to have enough space, otherwise when the slider goes up and down the zip it won't be able to. It'll be too near the stitching, it'll just get caught all the time. Okay, so that's about right, so I'll just tighten that screw there, and then we'll get on and sew. So let's fold back the main body of the fabric back out of the way, so all we're left with is our zip tape and our seam allowance with which to sew it onto. And you'll notice I've opened the zip all the way down to the bottom to keep the zip runner or the slider out of the way while we sew. So just line up that zip tape, put the foot down, and don't forget to switch back to stitch width or stitch length 2, like I haven't just then, from your basting stitch back to your normal stitch length. Okay, so I've just done that now, we'll carry on. Take your pins out as you go. So at this point, make sure your needle is in the zip tape, in the fabric. Lift up your sewing foot and slide the runner of the zip up past the foot. And this will stop any bows in your sewing. You don't want to come down nice and straight and then sew around the foot and carry on, because it won't look good. Okay, so place your foot back down. Get this lined up again. Get rid of that. And then carry on sewing. And there you have it. Just move that out of the way. That's one side of your zip sewn to your seam allowance, and we'll do exactly the same with the other side. And top tip, if you don't want to change your foot around, just turn your garment around and work from the bottom to the top, and then you won't have to. So I've just turned the garment around, made sure the zip tape is lined up nicely with the other seam allowance, and then we're going to sew this. Okay, so there you have both sides of your zip sewn to this zip tape sewn to the seam allowance. So we've sewn both sides of our zip tape to the seam allowance. The next thing to do is open it up, and working from the top of our garment, we are going to top stitch in through the right side of the fabric, through the seam allowance and through the zip tape in one go, and this will be visible on the outside of the garment, so it has to be quite neat. So your best work, and we're going to sew along one side, come across below the zip stopper, and then come and sew all the way back up to the top where we'll stop. Okay, so we're ready now to do the top stitching. Make sure your stitch length is 2, and start with some back stitching. The zip is fully open, Right, I've got to the zip runner now, so I'm going to put the needle in the fabric, lift the foot, turn over and slide the foot of the zip, the runner, up past the needle, if I can get hold of it, past the needle, and then we'll carry on. And now we're down to the zip stop, which is just under there, so I'm going to place the needle in the fabric, lift the foot, turn it 90 degrees and get your angles quite right, because this bit people will see, and I can just feel the zip stop there will foul on my zip foot, so I haven't gone far enough, so I'm going to turn it back. Do 1, 2, maybe 3 stitches more, and now I can feel I'm past the zip stop. Come to the other side of the zip, and then again leaving the fabric in. Okay, I need to go 1 more stitch there to get past the stop, get in the right position, so 1 more stitch, and then needle in the fabric, foot up, and then foot back down. Okay, when we get to the end, a little lock and stitch, probably 1 too many there. There you go. There's your top stitch all the way down, across and all the way up. And that'll hold your zip in place. Now next thing to do is to undo our basting along here and see what our zip looks like. So I've unpicked all the basting stitches, and that's left us with our zip opening, and now we can slide our zip up and down, and that's the closed and finished product. Obviously you'd
Thanks for watching me, Dave Dawson, with Dizzy Sew and Sew.
And I think we've covered well the centered zip insertion. And I look forward to your next sewing project, which will be using this zip insertion as the opening for a skirt. So I look forward to seeing you then. Don't forget to press the subscribe button.